Hi and welcome to everyone. We will wait one more minute to allow more people to join us. We have close to 100 people registered today. So we'll take another minute and we'll start. Okay, so I want to start and thank you very much for joining us to this webinar. I'm very excited to open this webinar. My name is Renana Keydar. I'm an assistant professor of law and digital humanities at the Hebrew University. And this is the first event in a planned series of meetings dedicated to the comparative perspectives on the current legislative attempts by the Israeli government to fundamentally transform the regime in Israel. The proposed changes, for those of you who haven't followed the news in the last 2 weeks, really touch upon every aspect of the checks and balances between the three branches of government, from the appointment of judges to judicial review of the Knesset legislation, to judicial review or diluting the power of judicial review of executive power of the government and its ministers, significantly diminishing the role of the Attorney General and the government legal advisors as gatekeepers. Additionally, there are measures promoted also to shut down the public broadcast corporation, restricting the activities of civil society organizations, and more. A key argument that is raised by the proponents of these legislative amendments, the government, is that they do not deviate from any accepted norms of other democratic countries, citing different comparative constitutional examples from Canada, the US, and Europe. These examples are met with the argument on the other side that there is not a single democratic country in the world where a combination of all these arrangements exists. Moreover, in most democratic countries, there are other mechanisms in place to limit the power of the executive branch. And the fear is that the selective borrowing of arrangements that strengthen the government's power from foreign countries without the arrangements and mechanisms that balance them in these countries, that exist in these countries, will lead to democratic deficit in Israel, bringing it closer to Hungary, Poland, or Turkey. Taking all this together, we see that the comparative examples and perspectives stand at the heart of the heated debate in the current constitutional crisis in Israel. Only today, the research department of the Knesset published a comparative review of the selection of judges, the process of appointment of judges for constitutional or supreme courts in various democratic countries. And this again immediately caused the debate, and the main question maybe that we pose here today is, can and should we compare? In order to address this question, we invited today two of the leading scholars in the field of comparative constitutional law, Professors Mila Versteeg and Chilton. So Professor Mila Versteeg is the Henry L. and Grace Doherty Charitable Foundation Professor of Law at the University of Virginia and the Director of the Center for International and Comparative Law and of the Human Rights Program. Professor Chilton is a professor of law and the Walter Mander Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. Versteeg and Chilton are longtime collaborators in conducting comparative studies on constitutional rights, and they recently also published their joint book in Oxford University Press, How Constitutional Rights Matter. Thank you very much, Adam and Mila, for joining us, and we'll have comments after their talk by Professors Keren, Weinshall, Yoav, Dotan, and Margit Cohn from the Hebrew University, from the law faculty. And before I give you to the floor, I want to pose two questions, or maybe meta questions, if you will. Can we actually learn anything from comparative examples, or does any such comparison can only be anecdotal or selective at best? And the second question, if we can compare, then what does your extensive experience tell you about the current state of affairs in Israel? So please, Adam and Mila.
Thank you for having us and for inviting us and for setting up this event. I'll talk first a little more briefly, and then Mila is going to follow and have a little bit more to say. I'll take both of the questions that you posed and say something briefly about each of those. First, can we learn anything from the comparative case? Now, here I'd like to start by sounding a note of caution, which is exactly the note implied by that question, which is what we can learn from comparative examples is often what happens on average around the world. So if a country's choose to adopt a particular right or a particular arrangement of separation of powers when they're in their constitutions, we may be able to say something about what the average effect of that is across different countries. But there's often a great deal of variation such that it's not a deterministic relationship, as in adopt this policy, change your courts in this way, and we know exactly what can happen. Now, as a result, Mila and I, in our own scholarship, for instance, in the conclusion of our book on constitutional rights, one of the main points that we've tried to emphasize is that there is a terrible track record of Western scholars trying to tell countries what to do with their constitutional or institutional relationships and just getting it wrong. And frequently, and this was especially true through the 90s and 2000s when there was periods of constitutional and judicial reforms where law professors from institutions like ours would travel around the world and say, your constitution should look like this, your court should be set up like that. And it's not obvious that, that the predictions or advice that was given at that time was particularly useful or got much right. So I'm, as a result, hesitant to give specific predictions, advice, or results about any individual country. Now, related to this point, the other thing that I would also like to note is that it's difficult to have views on these questions that are separated from your own prior political commitments. So let me say this. In the United States right now, we have a Supreme Court where there's a conservative 6-3 majority, and that court strikes down a great deal of legislation and is also taking steps to bar various executive action. I've publicly both said and written that I think that our Supreme Court should be reformed to be more democratic, which could either involve instituting term limits, adding more justices to the court, or changing the standing rules of the court. All rules that within the context of the United States, I think are important to ensure that a minority position doesn't control the political fate of the country. Now, the result is that it's that may be the correct view in the United States, and a different view might be correct in Israel, and I'm hesitant to draw too many extrapolations across context. So that's in response to your first point. Now, the second point, if we were to learn something from the comparative example, what would it be? Now, with the caveats I already mentioned about how we can only say things on average, and there's institutional specific reasons to be hesitant to draw too many examples. The point that I think is worth making here about what we can learn from the comparative example is it's a mistake to think that the way that democratic erosion occurs is that some person calls themselves an autocrat or a dictator and starts intentionally and flagrantly disregarding the existing legal and constitutional rules. So, for instance, in our book, we study Poland and Russia and Myanmar and Tunisia and a variety of countries that have experienced democratic erosion. And the way that this works is maybe in popular discourse, we say things like, oh, Putin took power and then immediately disregarded the Constitution. But the way that that occurs is Putin doesn't take power and say, I don't care about the Constitution, right? And I am going to violate provisions A, B, and C of the Constitution, and there will be no consequences. Instead, nearly the exact opposite happens. Instead, in Poland and Russia and these other countries, the party that takes power says, we deeply care about the rule of law, and we deeply care about the Constitution, and there are these other actors within the constitutional system or within the government that don't care about the rule of law. And what we have to do as a result is make changes through legal channels to change the distribution of power. And so the way this occurs is, for instance, changing the composition of judges, which is the way the first step took place in Poland, to say we're going to get rid of the existing judges on the Constitutional Court by instituting an age limit or a term limit or some other neutral sounding principle that has the consequence of changing the composition of the courts. After doing that, then new legislation is proposed with a more friendly court, and this process of democratic erosion takes place through formally legal steps that have the net effect over time of weakening independent institutions. Another way, for instance, this occurs in the Russian case is with the media. So the media will, the existing regime will take one step at a time to say the media should have different rules governing its political commentary during the news, or its advertising policies, or its discussion of various topics. And then slowly, as these reforms are instituted, the independent media is walked back. Now, it's after many of these steps where the rights of the majority political coalitions, the rights of the court, the rights of the media are then taken, that only when you step back, you can realize that the independent checks on a political party have been weakened. And then after that, it's easier and easier for the party in power that's made these changes to win re-election and to win re-election with bigger and bigger majorities after they've changed the electoral rules, the political party rules, the rules on media, et cetera. In other words, the way that we see democratic erosion occur is through a series of formally legal steps that are designed to weaken independent checks on executive power. Now, those take place in different ways in different countries. They're not always the same. There's not one playbook. But the basic pattern, I think, is that's the way this occurs over time. Now, I want to hand off to Mila, who is going to discuss this a little bit more in depth and fill in more details about this general process of democratic erosion.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to first jump in and dig a little bit deeper on the things that Adam just mentioned. And then second, I want to pose a question to my esteemed colleagues at the Hebrew University for something I'm trying to wrap my head around. So first, so as Adam pointed out, many of the, in a process of democratic erosion, many of the reforms that are proposed are done in a very legalistic manner, but they're also often portrayed as being pro-democratic, right? We're giving majority back to the people, or we're taking democracy back to the people. We're getting at counter-majoritarian institutions like the court, right? And I think in the Israeli debate, whenever I read about it, there's people who say this is pro-democratic, and there's people that say it's anti-democratic, right? And part of this depends on what do you mean by democracy. I think when we're undermining the power of the court, maybe what you're really eroding is liberal democracy initially, right? And a liberal democracy being a democracy where the majority cannot always get what they want, right? That's our definition of a liberal democracy. But maybe you're also eroding democracy in a sort of more narrow sense. The majority can get what it wants if these processes of these legal proposals ultimately lead to changing the electoral rules so that you stack the deck against your political opponents, right? So you have a series of steps. Autocracy starts at the ballot box, right? You get you elect a leader that is, it has illiberal tendencies. Then the first steps of proposals are reforms undermining counter-majoritarian institutions. So they're aimed at liberal democracy. But maybe in the longer run, you're moving to a place where once these institutions are neutralized, you can actually start changing the electoral rules and stack the deck against your political opponents so that it's harder for power to shift. And then you also lose democracy in a more narrow sense, right? And this can be confusing because we're calling it anti-democratic, but really it's kind of pro-democratic initially, right? So this is, and I think one question is for Israel, is these pro-democratic moves, are they ultimately the beginning of a path that would lead toward the loss of democracy in a more narrow sense? That question is really hard to answer for an outsider, for what it's worth. But I want to pose a few observations. The first is that I think whenever this happens, this process of gradually eroding democracy, it's usually a series of piecemeal reforms, and each of these reforms by themselves don't seem that outrageous. But once you start adding them all up, that's when you see, oh, there's this a sort of more orchestrated attack on the liberal constitutional order and maybe on democracy as a whole. So I think one lesson from the comparative literature is look at the whole package, not at one proposal. And my sense is in the Israeli context, a lot of attention has been on the override proposal, but I think it's important, what's the package as a whole. Second point is that the phenomenon of referring to what other countries are doing is very common when you see these kinds of reform. illiberal reformers have perfected the art of making the reforms seem pro-democratic by pointing at the experiences of other countries. But when something is liberal, when you borrow it, it doesn't mean that it's still liberal after it's been imported and implemented, right? So a notable example is political constitutionalism. It's a very important concept in UK constitutional law, which is meant to preserve parliamentary sovereignty. It means that now that the UK has the Human Rights Act, there can be a declaration by courts that a law is unconstitutional, but then it's up to Parliament whether to do something about it. So they have a weak tradition of judicial review. So this was widely relied upon in Hungary and Poland, and say, well, what we're just doing is politically constitutionalism like the UK. But it turns out that the political constitutionalism in Hungary and Poland was very different from the political constitutionalism in the UK. So in short, when these concepts travel, they change, right? And by analogy, it's likely that an override mechanism in Israel is going to be very different than an override mechanism in Canada. In Canada, many describe it as a political shaming mechanism. Yes, it exists, but if Parliament would declare that it passes a law that contradicts the Constitution, there will be likely political consequences, right? This alerts the public. There will be political mobilization around it. In fact, it's rarely used in the Canadian context because it serves that function, right? But big question mark, what will this look like if this were implemented in Israel? A related observation here that I want to make is that we are pretty bad as comparative scholars and experts at detecting, when these reforms are actually abusive or ultimately undermine the liberal democratic order. So, for example, in 2010, a series of constitutional amendments was passed in Turkey that entailed widespread judicial reforms. And one of the things it did, it increased standing for the Constitutional Court. There was also some technical changes to how judges were appointed. And the Venice Commission, right, which is kind of the democracy watchdog at the Council of Europe, said, oh, this is a great proposal. And then it turned out, with the benefit of hindsight, that this proposal was actually maybe the beginning of the end of democracy in Turkey, right? So we can't always know where these things are going to go. And conversely, we may have called out proposals as undemocratic that turned out not to be undemocratic. But maybe the lesson here, or the question I guess to raise is it more harmful to be wrong or to sort of be wrong about their proposals being harmful, or be wrong about them being harmless? And if then that's it's better to be wrong about them being harmless, then maybe we should call out these proposals, right? And raise the alarm, something along those lines. So those are sort of the general comparative questions that I wanted to sort of raise based on what Adam said. I want to end with a question for my colleagues at the Hebrew University, because as I was reading up on what's going on, and especially the override clause, I kept thinking, why does Israel need an override clause? And this may be a really dumb question, but let me explain where I'm coming from. So it seems to me it already has an override clause as things currently are, right? So if the Supreme Court invalidates a statute based on the basic law, then the Knesset can simply amend the basic law, and the basic laws can, for the most part, be amended by ordinary majority, and therefore an ordinary majority can override the court. Okay, let me take one step back and sort of take this, make this sort of a comparative point here. So legislatures override courts all the time, right? This is actually very common, and the way this happens is by amending the Constitution. So for those who are deeply familiar with US constitutional law, this may be a somewhat odd point, because the US Constitution is notoriously hard to change and amendments happen very rarely. But constitutions around the world, constitutions in other countries, frequently get amended. But it turns out it's every 4 years on average that a constitution gets amended. And very often this is done to either overturn a Supreme Court decision or a constitutional court decision, or maybe to preempt certain constitutional interpretations, right? But constitutional amendments are often a back and forth between the legislature and courts. It's very common. It happens all the time. Now, for most countries, you would think this may be harder than it is for Israel, because most constitutions are entrenched, meaning they have to be changed by a supermajority somehow. Although whether it's hard to change the constitution really depends very much on the political context, right? 3/4 of parliament can be really hard in some cases and easy in others. For me, the most striking example is always the comparison between Japan and the US state of Alabama. Why do I compare the two to each other? Which is a bit of an odd comparison, but it turns out they have the same amendment provision. And it's not a coincidence that they have the same amendment provision, because General MacArthur and his team after World War II wrote the Japanese constitution, and they borrowed from US states on how to amend it. It was like 2/3 of 2 subsequent legislatures or something like that. Turns out Alabama is the most amended constitution in the world. The Japanese constitution is the least amended constitution in the world, right? So because not even when national defense is at stake, the Japanese can amend their constitution. So, but the point is that in many countries, it's quite politically feasible for legislators to overturn the court by constitutional amendment, to override the court through constitutional amendment. And I'd like to think, since the majority of Israel's basic laws are not entrenched, they can be changed by an ordinary majority in the Knesset. And part of me thinks, okay, so this means it's technically relatively easy to do so. But on the other hand, I also appreciate and understand that this may be politically a little bit harder, right? Because there's certain symbolic significance to changing basic laws, and that this would be a sort of an alarm raising function, like, oh, this means that we're doing something that affects the basic laws, so therefore this doesn't really happen. But to me, like as an outsider looking in, with all the important caveats that Adam made, right? So that basically I don't know what I'm talking about, is that it seems like a compromise. Like if it were become a little more common for the Knesset to overturn the constitution of the Supreme Court by amending basic laws, but without adopting this reform proposal, then maybe that's sort of like a compromise, because on the one hand, it would be possible to overturn Supreme Court decision, but on the other hand, it would be politically harder to do so, right? Because you would have to go and explain why you're changing basic laws, why you're messing with those, or something along those lines. Now, I understand that in some countries, in some countries, this is not possible, because then the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court has then in turn said, hey, you can't keep doing this. You can't constantly overturn us by changing your constitution. So this is an interesting area of comparative constitutional law, where Supreme Courts have said you cannot amend certain parts of the Constitution because they're fundamental or super entrenched or so on, like the Indian Supreme Court and other courts have done this. But it seems very unlikely that the Israeli Supreme Court would come up with an unamendability doctrine, and to my understanding is there is not a robust doctrine along those lines. And in the current political climate, it seems very unlikely that there would be one. But my question is, why is this proposal necessary if this mechanism is already available, right? It's already possible for an ordinary majority to override the court. Okay, with that, I will end. I have more observations, but I also love to hear what other people have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Mila and Adam. That was a very thought-provoking beginning, and I think also some constructive thoughts with all the caveats of not proposing specific changes. I take your question as a serious one, but I also want to caution us not to only examine the proposed legislation through the override clause, because as you both said, it's always a package. It's not just one thing. But since we have here 3 panelists that are very much the experts on that, then I want to start, and I will turn it to Keren. Please, Keren Weinshall.
Hi. Thank you, Renana, for organizing this, and thank you, Adam and Mila, for stepping in and speaking out. I heard what you said about changing like these happening in stages, and kind of long-term legal stages where each stage kind of makes a bit of sense or doesn't look that bad, but the whole package is bad. And I think in one sense, I think we're very fortunate here in Israel that the government brought all this together at once and is in a hurry to get it all over by April, I think we're told now. So the whole package just cannot be ignored. This means that while I actually do agree with you on the override clause, for example, and while some of the parts in the package I actually would think of, I know the true intent behind it because I see the whole package, right? So I think one of the most important things in your work, Adam and Mila, and especially in your last book, was kind of saying that whether you have a constitution or not, constitutional rights only matter if they're enforceable, right? If someone enforces them, if it's costly for the government to violate them. That's one of the important lessons from your latest book, I think. So I want to focus here on a change that I think will make our rights not enforceable, which is, I think, the most dramatic change in all the entire reform, and that's in nominating judges. So judiciary basically is, I guess, one of the most important bodies enforcing constitutional rights. As it is now, there's a proposal to change the committee nominating judges. Just I'm guessing most of the people here know, but just to put us on the same level, the committee now is composed of 9 members representing 4 different bodies. So there's 3 Supreme Court judges, 2 lawyers from the Bar Association. So together they form the 5 kind of professional legal representatives. And then there's 2 ministers, the government branch, and 2 parliament members. It used to be that one was from a coalition and from 1 parliament member from the opposition, but it was a constitutional convention that kind of died, showing us how constitutional conventions are sometimes weak. And today it's 2 coalition parliament members. So 5 professionals, 4 politicians from the governing coalition, and the reform plan means to change it and have. So now we will have, or hopefully we will not have, 3 ministers, 3 parliament members. 2 of them are from the coalition, 1 from the opposition. So that means 5 members, 5 politicians from the coalition, 1 from the opposition. There will no longer be any bar lawyers in the committee, so they're out. And instead of them, 2 public representatives appointed by the Minister of Justice, who is the head of the committee, will be appointed. So basically the ruling coalition, which is the government, right? We have a parliamentary regime. So the ruling coalition is the government, basically. So the ruling coalition will have 7 representatives in the committee nominating judges, which gives them the majority to appoint anyone. A Supreme Court justice today needs to have 7 votes out of 9 in the committee. That meant until today, there had to be some kind of compromise between the different bodies, and no one could appoint a justice without the agreement of the justices. But of course, you needed the politicians. You couldn't appoint any judge without them to the Supreme Court. So anyway, the idea is to change it so the ruling coalition could basically appoint any judge they want. It's 1 branch, not 2 branches because of the parliamentary regime. So basically we'll have one branch governing everything, governing the parliament, government, and the courts. This will, I think, necessarily impact the court's independence. They would not be able to be independent because the same committee has the ability to fire judges. So with a 7 vote in the same judicial committee, the same committee where the coalition has the majority of 7 representatives, they can fire judges. And of course which I must say that's kind of an Armageddon scene, that they will do that and fire judges, but what they will be able to do is promote judges. So the same committee promote judges through the court system. All judges want to be promoted. All judges make decisions with some decisions to different degrees, even in lower instances with kind of political implication. So I can't see that they'll be independent as they are today. So Renana started this meeting asking if we should and what we should learn from a comparative perspective. And I very much appreciated both your answers, which is we should be really careful and not learn too much. I'm not sure if I have a definite answer to the question, but I do know this. I do know that comparative scholarship is now being used to justify this reform and change in the committee for nominating judges. And I say comparative research because it's fake science, it's pseudoscience, and I'll explain what I mean when I say it. So I'm pretty sure that if you do want to learn something from what happens in other countries and other ways of appointing judges, at least it has to be done right, which is not the case at the moment. So we see a lot of comparative studies comparing the way, actually, okay, so the ones supporting this change are saying that in many other constitutional courts, judges are appointed by solely by political parliament or government, or a combination of them both. And I think comparing what constitutional courts do to the committee for nominating judges to all court instances in Israel. So this change is supposed to happen to all judges in Israel, not only the Supreme Court judges. I think that's it's just wrong. Even comparing constitutional court judges and their nomination proceedings to ones in the Israeli Supreme Court is incorrect, because constitutional courts do other things. They decide on solely on constitutional matters and on law. The judges they're different judges. Many of them have not been judges before, but are either lawyers or sometimes politicians. They have terms of serving in constitutional courts, which is all very different in Supreme Courts and in apex courts of mostly of common law tradition, like in the Israeli Supreme Court. So it's just wrong to compare them. And if you look at the same countries and their judicial nomination procedures for judges that are not in the constitutional court, but in Supreme Courts or other courts, you see that they mostly have nominations by professional, either judges or lawyers. But I don't think we should compare what happens in Israel to these courts as well. I think if we want to compare ourselves to anyone, it has to be more of a common law tradition, or judges that are not specialized. So even if we look at those countries and courts, I see fake science all around. I see lots of supporters of the reform kind of confusing between who does the official appointment and who does the selecting of the appointees. most common law countries, and I'm thinking of the UK Supreme Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, the Philippine, the Indian, and Ireland. Those are the courts of most of common law countries, or many of them. They have some kind of committee combining judges, lawyers, and politicians that select the nominees, and then the appointment are done by the prime minister or some kind of minister. So it's a combined procedure. The US and Australia are basically the odd ones out, and we not what happens in most countries. And I'll finish again by saying thank you for coming here and speaking. Thanks.
Thank you, Keren. So Mila and Adam will let you comment on everything at the end, but I want to pass the speaking right to Yoav now to highlight another aspect of this package of constitutional changes.
Yes, good evening. I'll start in saying something about the value or problemacy of comparisons. Comparisons are extremely dangerous, and particularly in the subject we are talking about. And you see all the sides in this debate in Israel are using these comparisons, but each of them is using those components that serve their causes. For example, I've just heard from a journalist this afternoon that the head of the Knesset committee, MK Rotman, is citing my work to support his claim that we need a reform in judicial appointments. So I ask myself, how come? I've never supported any changes in judicial appointment, but he took some components of my work, ignoring all the rest of it, and then presenting it as if he can refer to academic work to support their reform. So I don't know how many of our audience know, but about 6 weeks ago, we did a conference on Adams and Mila book on constitutional rights, on the impact of constitutional rights. And I think I was so fortunate that we did this conference on their book at this point of time, at this unfortunate point of time in Israel history, I would say, because it did exactly the following thing. It gave us the comprehensive picture, the big picture. This is what I got from this book, and then when all these processes in Israel started, I mean, on the face of the matter, as a very adamant critic of judicial activism in Israel, I was supposed to be pro this, some of the, at least pro this reform, because at least some of the proposals that these guys are putting on the agenda of the Knesset are pretty positive if you look only at the relationship between the court and the Knesset on the narrow picture. But then I've looked at the biggest picture, and the biggest picture that this is not a narrow constitutional move to correct some problems with the relationship of the Israeli Supreme Court and the political branches. Rather, it's part of a much wider plan. So we saw what this government is doing to the media. They are going at the public media. They want to wipe it out altogether. We see what they are doing to the autonomy of the police. They already did it to the autonomy of the command of the IDF. We saw what they are trying to do to the autonomy of the Israeli bureaucracy at large. So for me, it was the fact that I have the background of your book made it easy for me to come out against this reform, although some of these proposals, if I had looked at it for the narrow view of constitutional law, I was supposed to support it. Now, I would like to, I would first refer to Mila's question about why do we need an overread? We need an overread because right now we don't have, yes, you have the Knesset, the political branches, the Knesset, and then you have the court, but their relevant powers are not exactly defined. Certainly not the Constitution, but not even in a clear constitutional manner. And worse of it, none of the parties, that is the Knesset or the political branches and the court, acknowledge the legitimacy of the powers of the other branch. So instead of having Philadelphia here, what we have is a scenario from the Game of Thrones, where each party is on the hill and on the other side of the valley with their swords in the air. So the whole idea about the overread, and I'm not saying that I'm supporting the overread that is proposed now by the Knesset, by the government, but the whole idea of the overread is to put this conflict into some kind of a track where it can be handled without a constitutional, a whole-out constitutional crisis. I don't know if we can get it. Maybe we can't. But you cannot say that we know now what's going on and each side has their own power, because this is far from this. The Knesset does not acknowledge the power of the court to strike down laws, let alone basic laws, and the court is already talking about an unamendability. The court is talking loud and clear about unamendability doctrine. So had we been able to reach some kind of an agreement about a reasonable overread mechanism, that would have helped us to avoid this very dangerous state of affairs. Now, another thing, maybe the most important that I extracted out of your book, is the importance of the public reactions, the importance of demonstrations. And you don't, and what you showed in your book, that every time that there were 100,000 or more people in the streets, they succeeded in at least postponing some of these democratic decay processes. Now, we already have more than 100,000 people in the street. And what I told all my colleagues, and I told everybody we are talking with, this is the place, this is the arena that we can win this. And the arena is not the High Court of Justice, and it's not the Knesset. The arena is the street. And what we saw now in Israel is not only the reaction of the street, but also the reaction of the business community, the legal community, the business community, the financial sector, and the reaction of players outside, international players. So altogether, I'm pretty optimistic about the ability of Israeli civic society to win this battle, at least for now, at least to stop this blatant attack on our democratic institutions. But I wonder, from what you know and your experience, what do you think about the Israeli reaction, the political reaction in Israel, if you compare it to other venues such as Poland, such as Hungary, and so forth? So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoav. We'll turn to our last commentator, Margit, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to build on Keren's contribution and focus on the way international comparison of different systems is abused to an incredible extent by proponents of the changes. Of course, this is presented, submitted, it appears in the papers. I'll give you one glimpse of what they argue. Please, I have two tables, but none of them are ready for full submission. But here's the first one. No, I need to share. You don't see that yet. Just
Please share.
Yeah, I just have to close this down, click share, and this is it. This is the one. Okay, I will just look at the last rubric. They claim there is some person there who claims that in the past 110 years, the House of Lords has not functioned as a second house, okay? We are working on that. In no other country, and this really refers to the title of this webinar, do we find the features that we find in Israel. Okay, so this is presented as the truth, the comparison of truth. I could talk about a bit more, but I think what I'll do is move immediately to our table. We are trying our best to inform the public what the real situation is. It's getting more and more difficult because those tables are really sent all over the place. So we show that in all other countries, there are two houses of parliament. This comparison is first directed at showing that the inaccuracies, but I'll also mention now, so I don't forget later, that of course we cannot, as in Mila and Adam's book, we cannot just look at the written provisions. We have to see what happens, and we also need to go and check the legal culture, political culture in all of the compared systems, which of course is not done. Now, we show that in all the other countries, except Israel, there are regional elections, another form of checks and balances. There's a gross misrepresentation of the British system, which we are trying to correct, but you know, our audience is mixed. Those who propose those changes in our regime are really not interested in the truth. They consistently send out comparative tables that have very little to do, or somewhat are limited in the way they depict reality. I will focus on now on the issue of legal culture. The argument is that only in Israel have courts created a form of removal from office of ministers, etc., criminally indicted, requiring them to, ordering them to be removed from the government. Only in Israel has the unreasonableness doctrine been used like this. Well, apart from the fact that this has been used very rarely, we must be aware, and this is really refers to the care we have to take in comparison. We must be aware that the political culture in Israel is way different from the political culture in all of these compared systems. I'm not talking about somebody serving in prison. I'm not talking about allegations that in most sort of substantiated allegations that in those systems lead to resignation. Not in Israel. In Israel, you know, we continue as usual. We will just blame the courts if they find that this is unreasonable. So that is one very important element that is not also in this table, because table is supposed to show the formal structures. That's why I'm a bit wary of overusing comparison tables. I'm only doing this just to show that if they can do comparative tables that are full of inaccuracies, we can do comparative tables that are more accurate. There's another element that nobody talks about in the debate over there, that all the compared systems are subject to a certain degree to transnational arrangements. Some of them are subject to transnational courts, while Israel is not a member of any transnational arrangement, and therefore, well, you know, there's a Hague court which Israel refuses to adopt or to take into account. So when we do have no external formal checks on the government, and we lose all the internal checks that are proposed by the proponents of these regime changes, we are left with a single branch of government. By the way, last week I was at the Constitution Committee in the Knesset, and before he left the committee, the chair, MK, what's his name? Oh, I'm happy I forgot his name, you know, said, well, as we know, Montesquieu said there is only one branch of government. Okay? And I had to say something about that. And then he said, no, you're not right. You're incorrect. So this is the way it's being worked. Apart from having a sort of an idea about how to advance, they call it a reform that will actually break down Israeli democracy, they use what Keren referred to as fake scholarship to support them. By the way, the document that Keren referred to, actually authored by the Knesset research body, did not address the fact that you cannot really compare common law systems to civil law systems in the way their Supreme Courts are constituted and operate. Keren mentioned that. I want to add that. So I won't take much more time because we need some discussion, but I'll end this by saying there are false claims running around, happily adopted by those who think that they can show that they have basis for their argument that Israel is a unique system with the least, power granted to the government, the highest power granted to the courts. It doesn't matter if it's the truth or not. You know, we live in the era of fake news, and we are seeing this as we speak. So thank you very much. I can end the share.
Thank you, Margit. So for the last 5 minutes that we have for discussion, and we'll see if we get also questions from the audience, I want to refer back to you, Mila and Adam, and to ask you, based on these very, dim views that we heard now, not only if there's a point to compare, but also if we already compare, then what do you take from comparative perspectives to the chances for succeeding in, stopping such a autocratic, democratic attempts for illiberal reforms? And in your book, indeed, you are not very optimistic about such chances, and you're very much, hedging them to very specific organizational rights and specific such conditions. But I want to add what maybe came up very strongly from Keren and Margit, and that's the question of fake science, fake news. So where does that all add to the difficulties of stopping such attempts for illiberal reforms?
Shall I go, or Adam, do you want to go first?
You can go. If you...
Okay, so so a lot of questions there, right? And I know time is limited, but let me first go to the question about do we compare, how do we compare? One of the oldest debate in comparative law is what is the right method to compare? And this debate, I mean, there's so much been said about it. There's the formalist, like looking at the text, the rules on paper. There's functionalism, that you look for functional equivalence across different systems. There's those who think comparison can only be done with deep cultural knowledge. Some people think we can't compare at all. These debates sometimes feel stale, but actually I think it may be some time for some methodological discipline in comparativism again, in this sort of traditional sense of methodologism that we've long talked about. So I want to mention one example. So when the US Supreme Court was deciding Dobbs, right, the case which basically refers to abortion rights, there was two comparative law briefs in front of the court. One of them was a conservative brief, and it basically pointed out in pretty much every other country, the time to get an abortion is much shorter. The US is with its up till the second trimester is an extreme outlier. We're going to put ourselves much more in line with modern Western nations if we have shorter limits. Then the progressive brief, which I was a part of, was like, well, that doesn't really look at the full context, right? If you look at these countries, they have actually exceptions for a woman's mental health up until the third trimester, meaning you can always get an abortion if you want. Plus, they have better reproductive health care, plus many other. So it goes to show with comparativism, you can accomplish any objective you'd like, and that's inherent in the enterprise. I think maybe what we have to force ourselves to do as comparativists is think more about what method we use to compare and what's the comparison we're making. If I may make one other point, Yoav's point about like, how do we defend the constitutional order in the street? So one of the insights from a book is, yes, like being able to get mass movements and people in the street is very powerful. But there is one big risk, which is that these movements are often leaderless movements, right? They have no formal leader. And if you go around and ask the people that are protesting, what are you protesting for? You may get slightly different answers. If you go around and ask the people, what is the next step in this protest? They may not know the answer, right? So I think it's important to use both the tools of mass organizations as well as to have some formal structure, formal leadership. I think that's important. And then if I just get 30 seconds on Keren. So the comparative experience does indeed show that many countries have a more political process to appoint judges, right? But you're also right that these contexts are very different. It's often a constitutional court, which is a negative legislature, different kind of body than a Supreme Court. But most importantly, the comparative experience also shows, which again shows you the two phases of comparison, that whenever you mess with appointment procedures of how judges get appointed, the outcomes is almost always bad. Now, I haven't done an empirical study to confirm that, but I can't think of any counter example. So I think, again, it's a hard question. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Please, Adam.
So to build on, start by building on something that Keren raised, which is that I think one finding that is consistent in the comparative literature is the exact set of constitutional rights or provisions that countries have providing rights in their constitutions doesn't correlate particularly highly with how good they are at respecting rights. And of course, there's examples like Australia or the UK or Israel, where there's doesn't have the same tradition of codified constitutional rights as, let's say, the United States or South American countries, et cetera. But what does correlate is judicial independence. Now, and so countries with more independent judiciaries have a greater tradition of respecting rights. Now, here's then how I think what gets to the point that was raised by all three panelists about the potential of abusive borrowing of comparative examples. And that is this, is that the de jure forms that independence courts take widely vary. And what I mean by that is, and this came out in Margit's tables, is that there's countries that have strong liberal independent traditions with all variety of institutional arrangements. Some that will have parliamentary systems, others presidential, some that have strict term limits for judges, others that have life tenure, et cetera. And so you can see this heterogeneity of institutional arrangements that exists. Now, what that means is that there are good examples that you can pull from of countries that have this institutional arrangement or that institutional arrangement to make the arguments that you want. Whereas you could just easily do the opposite, right? We could all pull from, the autocratic countries, anti-democratic countries, et cetera, that also have a wide variety of institutional arrangements. But I think what's key is that consistently across regimes that finding ways to respect independence does seem to matter a large amount, even though the ways that you respect institutional independence can take different forms.
So thank you, Adam and Mila. Just one question to close with. So taking, maybe a step back, what should be the role of the courts in the situation vis-a-vis this question? So when the court is, implicated within the process of these changes. So in, 30 seconds from each of you on this question.
So as we mentioned at the start, in Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, and all three of these democratic rollbacks, one of the key first steps was rolling back the institution, the independence of the courts. And that came through changing the appointing process and the docket and the powers of what they had to review. Now, in these instances, I think that the courts themselves are often not particularly institutionally prepared to defend themselves, in that they don't necessarily have the platform. They need to maintain some political independence. They can't directly speak on political developments in the right ways. And so I think the role of defending the institution of the courts falls to civil society and falls to the public in the way that Yoav described about the need for civil society movements, mass protests, taking to the streets, et cetera. And so I think that the courts themselves are not necessarily well positioned to defend on their own. That's it. I'll hand over to Mila to.
I would echo that. So in Poland, the constitutional court tried for about a year, right, and then ultimately lost. My sense is, if the Israeli Supreme Court is now loudly announcing, oh, if you do an override, we're going to do an unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine, isn't that just pouring oil on the fire, or whatever the metaphor is? I just, I wonder if it should be indeed left to civil society and ordinary citizens to be doing this defending, as opposed to the court walking into this battle with, I don't know, maybe energizing those who want to undermine its independence. But I'm not sure what the right answer is. But I do think courts are not that well institutionally well equipped to defend themselves.
And our court is already, the composition is moving to the right and to the conservative as we speak. So we can't put too much faith in the court at the moment. All recent appointments were all of conservative justices. Sorry.
Yes, you have last words.
What should the court do? I think what the court is playing hardball. And I think they're doing the right thing. And I'll tell you why. Because I think the Knesset, or the initiator of all this move by the Knesset, are pretty surprised from what went on, because they had this idea that you have this elitist court with no public support whatsoever. So, and this is a very activist court, which it is, I think, can be described. But they have no public support. They have no divisions, and it's just an elitist, a small bunch of elitist jurists that are trying to run the country. And suddenly they see that the court does have divisions. So on the part of the court, I think the court should play hardball, because in the meantime, the court should not give up now. Because the more the things are going to drag, the wider the consequences for the governments are going to be on the economic, financial sector, etc. So at one point or another, I think Netanyahu will have to make an assessment whether this whole thing is worth it. And so the court certainly should not should not step down now or even blink. And by the way, they didn't. If you case, I don't know if you follow the case of Minister Doherty. They've just sacked a coalition minister in a very bold move, which was not self-evident at all under the circumstances. And for formal point of view, there were many questions there. So I think now, I mean, maybe the court should have. I think that the court should have played it much more cautiously. If you go back 10, 15 years ago. But now we are on the scene now. We are in the theater of war. So in the theater of war, you don't want to blink. You don't want to blink. You don't want to, and particularly when the court has all these, the court discovers that it has some significant support in a relatively not that narrow segment of the Israeli population. And also, if you look at public opinion does not, surprisingly, public opinion does not support this government move. The majority of the Israeli public, even people who voted for Netanyahu, some of them, they're against it. So if you take this all together, I think you can't win it in court, and nobody thinks you can win it in court. But I think the court is now playing the right moves. It's like the court is signaling, we are a kind of a tough, we are a tough target. It's not going to be easy for you. It's not going to end very soon. So you better be prepared to a very long and costly battle on your behalf. So I think, I mean, doctrine aside, but I think the court is politically speaking, I think the court is doing the right thing.
First of all, we can end in this optimistic note, or we can open the conclusion of Mila and Adam's book and see that even the strongest courts hold on for a year or so, and then they lose wind. So maybe you'll get a new comparative case study. And if not, then we'll have to host you again here to see how you offer us to advance in the battle. I want to thank Mila Versteeg, Adam Chilton, Yoav, Dotan, Keren, Weinshall, and Margit Cohn for joining me. I want to thank the audience for joining us. And hopefully we'll continue this in a second webinar next week with Tom Ginsburg from University of Chicago. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening and continue the fight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening,
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thank you.